Hello everybody, George Weber here, gWebberArts, and a few people have requested that I do a video on how I draw girls, or women, or anyways, you get what I'm saying. So I'm going to start with the absolute basics because as we get further into it, it'll make more sense. So the absolute basics, pretty much anyone can do, and that is draw a stick figure. Right? You can see that. That's a stick figure, more or less. And pretty much everybody can do that much. Even this one, the body's too long, but that's not the point. The point is pretty much anybody can do this. So from there, if we're going to carry it a little bit further, we're going to say, okay, we're going to do a fancy stick figure that has a neck and has shoulders and has a torso and has hips and has legs and arms. We still have a stick figure, but it's starting to look more like something. As we progress, we can say, let's fill out our stick figure, where we now have a head, a neck, a chest, a waist, hips, legs. Granted, I'm doing one-piece legs here, as you can see, and arms. So now we're getting closer to something that we recognize as a figure. Now, I can continue on with this, and I will a little bit, but I'll just say it right now. If you're looking to just draw a human figure, and you want to know what the proportions are and all that sort of thing, go to virtually any bookstore and find yourself a figure drawing book, or if you don't feel like you're a high-end artist that's going to be able to do, super lifelike figures, okay, great. Find a book on drawing comic book characters, and they will have almost always some version of how to draw the basic figure using basic forms, namely your triangles and your squares and your rounds and your what have you, to build a recognizable human figure. And it will give you all the proportions on, this needs to be X number of heads high, and this needs to be X number of heads wide, and all that sort of jazz. And you wind up with something like this, Granted, there's variations on this theme, but this is basically what you wind up with is a mannequin, so to speak, that gives you the basic understanding of, how to create a figure that has joints. And again, in a lot of these books, they'll tell you that the figure is X number of heads high, right? So if I were to do this, this figure is way too many. But we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about pretty close, 7 heads high, and then in terms of drawing faces, they're going to show you the basics of, you want to start with an egg shape or a circle with some sort of shape coming off of it, one of the two, if not a combination of the two, and you'll want to draw a center line, and about a third of the way down you want to do a cross line, and then that gives you an eye, let's say, and then the width of an eye is the distance between the eyes, right? And then the length of an eye is approximately where the nose is, and then the lower third, obviously, is the mouth. And there you have it. That's your basics for creating a head. And that's, again, this is all covered in so many books that there's no point in my going through all of it, because, first of all, I don't draw comic book characters. I draw cartoons, and cartoons tend to be more stylized. I also draw pinup girls, but even then I do them more stylized. And in terms of human anatomy, I don't do realism per se, where I'm drawing the figure exactly in the correct proportions. And that's the other thing you have to remember, is if you're drawing a real human being, right, the proportions of that and the proportions of a superhero character are different. In other words, a human female might be, let's say, 6.5 heads high, whereas in a comic book, because they want them to be heroic, she'll be 7 heads high, and a male character might be 7.5 heads high compared to a normal human male character. Again, when it comes to like a male character, your average male character, has a chest, a waist, and hips, and legs, right? Something like that. And then when you get into superheroes, all of a sudden they have a chest and a waist and hips and thighs and arms and neck and head, and all of a sudden the head is disproportionate to the body. I mean, sometimes all of a sudden the chest is like 4 or 5 heads wide instead of 2, or 2.5. You just have these big giant, muscular shapes and whatnot. And the idea, of course, is to create a superhuman, a more than. So again, when I'm drawing my girls, I'm using a similar take, whereas let's grab a different sheet here. I'll just flip this one over. Let's say I'll just kind of scribble something out here quickly. And this is not even vaguely accurate, but you'll get the general gist. So this would be kind of leaning into realism, you know, where, yeah, she, a woman is obviously going to have a waist and hips and so forth and so on, but the ratio change is generally going to be something in the effect that, looking at it straight on, it would be less. Most women have got hips that are larger than their male counterparts and a narrower chest compared to their male counterparts, as well as shoulders. Now, that's not always true, obviously, but frequently true. So when I'm drawing cartoon girls, first thing I'm doing is I'm exaggerating things. So we're going to take this same basic concept here, and now we're going to exaggerate it. Whereas we have the chest form, right? And then we're going to do the hips, which now I'm adding a lot more curve, as you can see. And then the arms. And just like that, you can see that this figure is considerably more exaggerated than this figure. This figure might be much closer to an actual human female in terms of proportionate lengths and sizes of the assorted anatomy and whatnot. And then this is more exaggerated. So, a big thing for me when drawing female characters is number one rule. There are no straight lines in the female body. Simple as that. There's no such thing as a straight line in the female body. Keep that in mind. The second thing is there are certain things that you want to stylize and exaggerate, and some things that you may or may not want to. Everything can be stylized and exaggerated. It's picking and choosing your battles when you're creating a given character. And an example of that might be if you are, and let's go back to this sheet just for a moment, if you're creating a character, to see, we've got the chest and the bust and some arms and some head. You can easily exaggerate the hips. And still have it look like something that makes sense. Because let's face it, some women, their lower body is a little bit on the larger side. It happens. It's normal. It's perfectly fine. What you don't want to do is and a lot of comic books do this, is take an average size body, something like this, and then exaggerate the bust to the point of absurdity. And yes, I've been accused of this occasionally, but I try to temper one with another. meaning that I try to balance the mass of the bust with the mass of the hips. If the hips are too narrow, then it just starts looking completely disproportionate and just completely wrong, and part of that is that the more you increase the bust, in theory, the chest cavity needs to be larger as well. And then if you wind up with these little tiny hips below this giant chest cavity and giant bosom, it just looks absurd. Whereas a woman naturally has wider hips, so to accentuate the hips a little bit and leave the bosom a little smaller makes perfect sense. But the minute you start exaggerating this, you need to exaggerate this to go with it. In other words, we can give her a little waist. All right, so here's our little waist. And then we can say, okay, she's going to be very buxom. So that means she needs to have hips and legs. So now when we have a oversized bosom to go with it, suddenly things start to make more sense. You see, there's a degree of balance. Even though her bust has become much larger than here, for example, the waist hasn't gotten much larger. The chest cavity even hasn't gotten much larger, but the hips have gotten larger to balance this. So the two are in balance with each other to some degree. And when you start throwing off that balance too much, it doesn't work. It doesn't look good. I mean, yes, you can say, okay, here's a girl with a very slight bust, and, maybe you're into it, I don't know, and she got big hips and big thighs, and it's like, yeah, there are human beings that look like that, So, again, it makes some sort of sense. It follows. But there always has to be some sort of balance in order for it to look good. Now, granted, there's variations on this theme that, can be based in reality. Like, some women have, fairly broad hips, very short waist, and their chest cavity starts almost immediately, so they really don't have much in the way of a waist. So again, you can base that in a reality and say, okay, this is, normal for the real world. But again, we're not drawing the real world. We're getting into an aesthetic that is based on something that's very stylized and has no real reality to it. It kind of does and it kind of doesn't. I mean, I've been told that, women aren't built like that, and I beg to differ. I've seen women that very much are built like that. Granted, they're extremely rare, and even then, the forms I'm drawing are somewhat exaggerated in certain areas, but, there are women that are extremely long-legged and curvy and busty and everything else, and are more cartoon-like than they are the typical, human anatomy. So that said, we're getting back to this, and what I was saying before is when drawing a female, no matter what, there should not be any straight lines, because if there's straight lines, it doesn't look right, it doesn't look good, it doesn't look anything, it just looks completely wrong. If I take even something as simple as this and give it curves, all of a sudden it takes on a different characteristic. As simple as that is, I mean, I can just literally do this. And there you have it. You've got a really basic but clearly feminine form. So whenever you're trying to think of posing your character, especially women, try to always think of something that is not straight. You know, in comic books, whether it's male or female, they stress a character needs to be dynamic, you know, because you can, again, going back to the male character for just a minute, you can, you know, create a character that, okay, yep, he's huge, right? He's big, he's huge. But he's also pretty boring. If you take the same thing and give it some dynamic action, it's much more interesting. And again, I'm just using really basic shapes. It's nothing fancy here. This is just really basic shapes, and that's your starting point for anything and everything that you're going to draw, is start with the most basics so you can find the form. You know, and again, it can be as simple as saying, okay, the shoulders are tilted this way, the hips are tilted this way, and the spine does this, which, you know, means that this is here, you know, okay, this is here, this is here, this is going to go this way, this is going to go this way. There's our zone there. Here's our bust, right? Shoulders. And let's do this. Let's have the arm go this way, right? Simple forms, but you have this motion and flow. And that's really what you're looking for. It doesn't matter if you can draw really well or if you draw kind of really simple nothing stick figures. If you take a simple stick figure and just give it some action, it becomes more interesting. As simple as it is, it's still more interesting because now it's doing something. It's flowing. It's dynamic. There's an action there. It even tells a story or makes you think, what is the story? What is he doing? What is this character doing? Oh, he has a knife. Is he sneaking up on somebody? What's the story there? Whereas if I draw the same character, basically doing, what's he doing? He's doing nothing at all. And the only question is when's he going to do something? So, it's a cold and rainy day. My hands are pretty much frozen, but we're going to give this a shot. So based on what I've been telling you, we're going to just, again, use the simplest forms that I've already kind of gone over. And then we're going to build on those forms. Some things to keep in mind is, chest cavity. In realism, you have a chest cavity that's something to this effect, right? You have the ribs coming up towards the center and then flowing out and down, and then the hip bones are something to this effect. Right, and you have a spine, and in between it's mostly muscle tissue and skin, and that's why you get these curves, right? And then again, the ladies have a little more wider hip bone and a little more padding on the hip area, right? We get right to the bikini zone here. There we go. There's her bikini zone. We'll give her a bikini just because we're going to be PG-13 here. Somewhere in there is her navel. All right. Now we need to give her a little roundness in the belly because there's the lower abdomen and then there's the upper abdomen. The rib cage sticking out slightly creates a little bit of a shadow and whatnot. Okay, that's great. We have a thigh. And again, when I draw women, it's stylized. So the thighs are a little bit longer, but not much, than what a normal torso length would be. And the torsos tend to be a little bit longer as well. Where I tend to exaggerate things is in the shins, because a normal leg, everything is proportionate, more or less, and that's great for real anatomy, but when you're drawing sexy cartoon characters, you want to lengthen the legs somewhere, somehow, and I just like the way long shins and calves look, and I rarely draw my characters flat-footed because flat-footed, again, doesn't look good and it doesn't accentuate the length. So there's my heel, there's my toes, there's my arch going up instead of toes arch and heel like that, which is mechanically correct but somewhat dull. So it's more like she's pointing her toes. And the other leg. In the background more, etc., etc. So we'll just shadow that quickly and not get too fancy with it. Doesn't matter. One thing to remember is that the shin bone does in fact have a gentle curve to it. It's not a straight line. Again, in the female anatomy in particular, there are no straight lines. Actually, in human anatomy, there's no real straight lines except for in the skeletal structure where certain bones are fairly straight. All right, so now that we've got that much done, this being the low point of the collarbones, you need to figure just slightly higher. Then, oddly enough, you bring a line down about 45 degrees, give or take, and run across like so, about a third and a third and a half, something like that. And that gives you your bust line in real life. And now, don't draw balls, because that's not what it is. It's actually got more muscle that comes up towards the shoulder and so forth and so on. So this is more the real shape, more of a teardrop almost. Okay, so we're going to say that's her bikini top, which will help you see how it works. There's the straps, right? And then the collarbone, the neck muscle of the shoulder here, and then the shoulder. We'll just do that as a ball for the moment, because that'll give us our basic structure. We have our neck. All right. Try to keep the neck fairly slender, and a little on the long side is nice. Here's top of the ear, where the ear meets the head, just below the top, should be more or less in line with the eyes. And then the lower portion is more or less in line with the nose. Again, not overwhelmingly important for our cartoon character, but knowing the rules makes it easier to break the rules. All right, so now we have that. We elongate this ball because that's the way the shoulder muscles are. They're elongated. And then we're going to give her some arms and hands. And there we have a very basic, and I mean, this is really basic. I'd work on this to figure out certain things with it, much more so if I was doing this as a final drawing. But it gives you the basic idea of a form. Now, I'll give you an example of when I'm drawing Pillow and Lucky. I use something like this, but it's even more stylized. So I'm going to pause the video here for a second, get some other paper and some other pencils, and we're going to play with that.